The phone on the flight test engineer's desk buzzed at 11 minutes past midnight, and the caller ID showed a number he had never seen before, a Toulouse area code that meant the headquarters of a rival he had spent his entire career dismissing. And in that single moment, the tectonic plates of commercial aviation shifted so quietly that nobody in the Everett factory would feel the tremor for another decade. He answered, and the voice on the other end was calm, almost apologetic, asking a question that no Boeing engineer had ever been asked by a European competitor, a question about whether the Americans had truly abandoned the very large aircraft market, and the engineer's silence was the only answer the caller needed, because that silence confirmed what Airbus had suspected for months, that the king of the skies was walking away from the throne without even realizing the crown was up for grabs. Now here is what makes this moment worth your attention. Because if you have ever watched a dominant player surrender a position and told yourself it was inevitable, or if you have ever felt that cold knot in your stomach when you realized the market had moved on without you, then you already know the shape of what happened next, and you know it better than the engineers who lived it. The story of how Boeing gave Airbus the skies is not a story about aerodynamics, and it is not a story about manufacturing excellence, and it is certainly not a story about one faulty part or one bad decision. Because the truth is far more uncomfortable. The truth is that Boeing surrendered the heavens through a series of choices that each felt reasonable at the time. Choices made by smart people in well-lit rooms who believed they were protecting something sacred. And the irony is that the very thing they were protecting, the certification that kept their old planes flying, became the anchor that dragged them to the bottom. Boeing had the market, and it had the reputation, and it had the relationship with regulators that no rival could touch. And in the early 2000s, it had a choice that would define the next 2 decades. A choice about whether to build a giant new aircraft to compete with Airbus, or whether to protect what it already had. And the answer it chose would echo through every delivery count and every grounded fleet for the next 20 years. The meetings happened in secret, in Seattle and in Toulouse, with engineers from both companies sitting across the table from each other, sharing feasibility studies and cost projections and market forecasts. And for a brief moment, it genuinely looked like the two giants might collaborate on a new large aircraft. And then Boeing pulled out. And the official statement was polite and corporate, saying the company was pulling out of the joint feasibility study. And Airbus, with a hint of bitterness that would prove prophetic, accused Boeing of deliberately drawing out the discussions just to stall the European effort. Now consider this, because it is the detail that changes everything. The detail that the casual observer misses entirely. Boeing did not pull out because the market was shrinking. And it did not pull out because the technology was impossible. It pulled out because it wanted to protect something else, something it valued more than innovation, more than the future. And that something was the original type certification of the 737, a piece of regulatory paperwork that had been the foundation of Boeing's dominance for decades. And protecting that piece of paperwork would eventually cost the company everything. To understand why a piece of paperwork held more value than the future, you have to understand what that certification actually was, a key that unlocked the ability to update an existing aircraft without subjecting it to the full regulatory gauntlet of a brand new design. And for Boeing, it was a license to print money, because recertifying a derivative of the 737 cost a fraction of what certifying a clean sheet design would demand, and every executive in the room knew that number by heart. That single spreadsheet cell, the cost differential between a derivative and a new build, quietly became the most powerful voice in the room, louder than any engineer who warned about the limits of a fuselage designed in the 60s, and louder than any market analyst who pointed at the shifting center of gravity in long-haul travel, because the spreadsheet logic was irresistible, and in the church of shareholder return, the spreadsheet speaks in tongues only the board can interpret. That spreadsheet cell held more authority than any engineer in the building, and once you see it, the world starts to make a different kind of sense. Subscribe before the next move lands, because the pattern you just spotted doesn't stop in aviation. Drop the word paperwork in the comments if you've ever suspected the real power wasn't in the hands of the people building anything at all. And here's where the story twists in a way that should make you uncomfortable, because the engineers who warned about the 737's aging architecture were not wrong, and the analysts who predicted the rise of the very large aircraft market were not wrong. But they were all outmaneuvered by a third argument, an argument that framed the new clean sheet design as a betrayal of the shareholders, a gamble on an uncertain market when the safe play was already in hand. The safe play, as it was called in the strategy documents, was to keep polishing the 737, to keep stretching it and updating its avionics and re-engining it until the maintenance crews and the pilot training departments and the airport gate configurations all locked the world into a web of dependency so dense that no rival could ever tear it down. And for a decade, that logic held, and the cash registers rang, and the market share charts looked like a straight line to heaven. The moment you feel secure in your edge, the market begins to build the trap, because the same dependency that locks out rivals also locks in your own inability to change. And while Boeing was reinforcing the walls of its fortress, Airbus was quietly doing the one thing that Boeing's strategy made impossible. Airbus was starting from zero. Now here is something that should make your hands go cold on the keyboard, because the difference between the two companies was not intelligence or talent or even money. The difference was what each company believed about its own past. Boeing believed that its past was a fortress to be defended at all costs, and Airbus believed that its past was simply a run-up to a building yet to come. And those two beliefs, held by equally brilliant people, would produce two completely different aircraft. And one of those aircraft would eventually be described in an internal airline memo as the only sensible choice for a long-haul fleet. And that memo was not written about the American plane. You have to picture the scale shift to feel the weight of it, because a very large aircraft is not just a bigger plane. It is a different economics altogether. It is a hub and spoke strategy, made concrete. It is the bet that passengers would rather connect through a single super hub than fly direct between smaller cities. And Airbus looked at that bet and saw a future of crowded runways at a handful of mega airports, while Boeing looked at the same data and saw a future of point-to-point routes that had not been invented yet. The divergence was not about the present, it was about the 20th derivative of the present, about two competing models of how 10,000 people would want to cross an ocean in 20 years, and both models were plausible, and both teams had spreadsheets thick enough to stop a bullet. And the only way to tell which one was right was to wait for the market to deliver its verdict, a verdict that would take nearly 2 decades to arrive. But here is the uncomfortable part that the strategy consultants left out of their slide decks, the part that only becomes visible in hindsight. One of those two bets required no compromise on safety, and the other bet, the one that insisted on stretching an old design again and again, kept asking the engineers to do more with less, to extract performance from a structure that was already at its limits. And each time the engineers said the margins were shrinking, a different kind of spreadsheet showed up in the meeting to explain why the margins were actually fine. When the first of the stretched variants entered service, the pilots who flew it noticed things that never made it into the marketing materials: a certain heaviness in the controls, a tendency to pitch up unexpectedly under load, software that seemed to fight the human hands at the yoke. And the pilots wrote those observations down in their flight logs, and the airline maintenance chiefs filed those logs away, and the regulatory authorities signed off on the certifications, because every box on the checklist had been ticked, and nobody was asking the question that mattered, which was whether the box itself was the right box. And that is the pattern, the one you have felt in your own market. The pattern where the checklist gets longer and longer while the underlying understanding gets thinner and thinner, where compliance replaces judgment and verification replaces vision. And if you have ever sat in front of your own screens and watched a carefully calculated position go sideways while the models all said it was fine, then you know exactly what those pilots felt, and you know the cold weight of realizing that the system you trusted was describing a world that was slightly, fatally, out of sync with the real one. The engineers inside Boeing who sounded the alarm were not radicals. They were the keepers of an older ethic, the belief that the machine you certify must be the machine you understand, and their warnings were detailed and specific, about flight control systems that would behave differently at the edges of the envelope, about training requirements that would be quietly waived to save costs, about a culture where the sales team's target number had become the engineering team's constraint, and one of them, after being overruled for the third time, walked into his garage and stared at the half-finished restoration of a 1960s car and realized that the only machine in his life he fully understood was the one he had built with his own hands. If you have ever felt that cold weight, the instant you realized the system you trusted was describing a world slightly out of sync with reality, then you are already inside the pattern this channel exists to deconstruct. Subscribe so you do not miss the next fracture we map. And in the comments, drop the single moment or specific trade that first taught you the checklist was lying. That engineer did not quit that day, and he did not leak documents that day, but something in him recorded the moment, the way a seismograph records a tremor too small to feel. And years later, when the first of the new aircraft was grounded after 2 fatal accidents, he would sit in front of the television and watch the news anchor read the details and realize that every single warning he had typed into the internal system had been correct. And the recognition did not bring vindication. It brought a hollow grief, because being right had cost him nothing. And being right had cost everyone else everything. Now ask yourself the question that the boardroom never asked. The question that cuts through all the quarterly earnings and the market share metrics, which is whether the problem was the aircraft at all, or whether the problem was the belief system that made the aircraft seem like a reasonable idea. Because the 737 was a good design when it was new, and the 737 was a good design when it was updated. And the 737 became a dangerous design only when the updates stopped being updates and started being contortions. Contortions driven by a financial logic that could not see its own endgame. And the endgame arrived in a way that nobody in the Seattle boardroom predicted. Not through a rival's superior marketing, and not through a sudden shift in fuel prices, but through 2 failures that, taken together, exposed the entire philosophy. 2 failures that could not be blamed on a single faulty part or a single careless pilot, because the pattern they revealed was systemic. And once the public saw that pattern, the fortress that Boeing had spent 20 years building turned out to be made of glass. The grounded fleets cost the airlines billions in lost revenue, and the delivery delays cost Boeing its order book. And the regulatory agencies that had once been Boeing's quiet allies suddenly found it politically convenient to scrutinize every single component. And the stock price, which had been the North Star of the strategy, began to collapse in a way that no spreadsheet had ever modeled. Because no spreadsheet had a line item for public trust, and no spreadsheet could quantify the cost of discovering that the thing you had built was, in the deepest sense, a lie. The Airbus team in Toulouse watched the whole collapse unfold with a mixture of horror and uneasy recognition, because they knew, better than anyone, that they were not smarter or more ethical than their American rivals. They were simply in a different position. They had been forced to build a new aircraft because they never had the old certification to protect. They had been forced to question every assumption because they had no assumptions worth defending. And out of that forced humility, they had built a machine that did not need to fight its own design to do its job. If you have ever felt the secret relief of starting from nothing, or the strange freedom of having no reputation to protect and no legacy to defend, then you know the quiet source of Airbus's strength. And you know why the underdog sometimes wins, not because the underdog is smarter, and not because the incumbent is stupid, but because the incumbent is shackled to its own past, while the underdog is free to build for the present. The lesson hides in the details of the engineering, because the aircraft that Airbus built did not need complex software corrections to behave predictably. It did not need pilot retraining to mask a design flaw. It flew the way a good airplane should fly naturally, and that naturalness was not an accident of superior aerodynamics. It was the physical expression of a company that had been free to listen to its engineers instead of its spreadsheets. And if you want to know which philosophy will win any long game, you only have to ask which one can afford to tell the truth. And that is the deepest inversion of the whole story, the inversion that the verdict delivers, because Boeing did not lose to a better product or a smarter strategy. Boeing lost to the truth, to the simple, stubborn, unglamorous truth that a design cannot be stretched forever, that a culture cannot override physics forever, and that a boardroom cannot protect its certification while sacrificing its future and expect nobody to notice. The truth was always there, sitting in the engineers' warnings and the pilots' flight logs, and the uneasy silence of the mechanics who signed off on planes they did not fully trust. The mechanics who signed those planes off did not do it out of malice. And they did not do it out of ignorance. They did it because the system had quietly redefined what their job meant, had shifted the question from, is this aircraft safe, to, does this aircraft meet the checklist? And those 2 questions sound identical until the day they produce completely different answers. And on that day, the mechanics learned what every retail trader eventually learns. That the difference between a rule and a judgment is the difference between surviving a storm and being the storm's headline. You have felt this shift yourself, the moment when the daily routine of checking your screens, of confirming your position sizes, of verifying that your stop losses are where you left them, slowly becomes a substitute for actually thinking about what the market is doing. And the routine feels productive, and the routine feels responsible, and the routine is quietly replacing the only skill that ever made you money, which is the ability to look at a situation that does not fit the pattern and trust what your gut is telling you before the spreadsheet catches up. The airline executives who kept ordering the stretched aircraft were not fools, and the regulators who kept signing the certifications were not corrupt, and the pilots who kept flying the planes were not careless. They were all participants in a system that had optimized for the appearance of safety while slowly hollowing out the substance of it. And this is the part that should frighten you more than any single failure, because it means the collapse was not an accident. It was the inevitable product of a culture that had stopped asking the one question that mattered. So what was the one question? The question that would have changed everything if anyone had dared to ask it in a boardroom. And the question is deceptively simple. It is whether the company was building aircraft for the people who would fly them or for the shareholders who would never sit in a middle seat. And the uncomfortable answer, the answer that the strategy documents danced around for 2 decades, is that the shareholders won that argument so completely that the passengers became a footnote, a variable to be managed rather than a reason to exist. And this is where the story stops being a story about aviation entirely, because every institution that loses its way follows the same descent, whether it is an aircraft manufacturer, a bank, or a trading desk. It begins with a success that feels permanent. It builds a system to protect that success. It hires brilliant people to maintain the system. And then it slowly forgets that the system was supposed to serve a purpose beyond its own continuation, until one day the purpose is gone and only the system remains, humming along efficiently, producing nothing but its own reproduction. You have watched this happen in your own world, watched funds that were once legendary become shadows of themselves, watched platforms that defined an era become relics, and you have probably told yourself that they were unlucky, or that the market changed, or that they made one bad bet. But the truth is more uncomfortable. The truth is that they stopped asking the question that built them, and the moment a trader stops asking why a position exists and starts asking only how to manage it, that trader has already surrendered. They just have not felt the loss yet. And if that truth lands a little too close to home, then you already know what happens next. Subscribe to this channel while you still remember why you started asking the hard questions, because the moment you stop is the moment the algorithm has already won. After you subscribe, drop the word "why" in the comments, not as engagement bait, but because I want to see how many of you just felt that same sharp recognition, the kind that tells you it is time to start questioning again before the surrender becomes permanent. Now here is where the evidence delivers its final verdict, and it is a verdict that should reshape how you think about every edge you have ever had. Because the data that emerged after the grounding told a story that the strategy documents had missed entirely. The data showed that the passengers, the ones the spreadsheet had reduced to a footnote, were not passive receivers of the company's choices. They were the ultimate arbiters, and when they lost trust, no amount of engineering, no amount of marketing, no amount of regulatory muscle could bring it back. The asymmetry of trust is the cruelest asymmetry in any market, because trust is built slowly, drop by drop, through thousands of uneventful flights and thousands of quiet confirmations that the system is working, and trust is destroyed instantly, in a single moment that everyone witnesses. And once that instant loss happens, it cannot be rebuilt by spending more money, or hiring more consultants, or issuing more statements. It can only be rebuilt by doing the hard, slow, unglamorous work of actually being trustworthy again. And that work takes years, and the market does not wait. Think about what that means for you, because you have an edge, something that has made you money, something that you understand better than the people who dismiss you. And the temptation, the one that every successful trader faces, is to systematize that edge, to turn it into a checklist, to strip out the judgment and replace it with rules that can be executed without thinking. And the moment you do that, you have built your own 737, you have stretched your own design past its limits, and you will not know it until the day the market delivers its verdict. The builders of the winning aircraft understood something that the spreadsheet culture could not see. They understood that their edge was not the machine they had built. It was the freedom they had preserved, the freedom to question their own assumptions, the freedom to listen to the engineer who said the margins were too thin, the freedom to delay a launch rather than certify a lie, and that freedom was not a constraint on their success. It was the source of it, and the moment they tried to trade that freedom for efficiency, they would become the next Boeing. So the question that should follow you out of this story is not about aircraft, and it is not about market share, and it is not about the relative merits of two engineering cultures. The question is about what you are protecting, because if you are protecting a system that once worked, a routine that once made you money, a reputation that once opened doors, then you are standing exactly where Boeing stood, and the market is already building the aircraft that will make your fortress obsolete. But if you are protecting something else, if you are protecting the ability to see clearly, the freedom to change your mind, the willingness to start from zero when the evidence demands it, then you are standing where the underdog stood, and you already know why the underdog wins. Not because it is smarter and not because it is luckier, but because it has nothing to defend and everything to learn. The last image that should stay with you is not the grounded aircraft and not the collapsed stock price. It is the engineer in his garage, the one who saw his warnings dismissed, working on a machine he understood completely, a machine with no hidden software and no compromised margins, a machine that would never lie to him, and in that quiet workshop, with the smell of old oil and the feel of cold metal under his fingers, he was not escaping the world that had betrayed him. He was remembering the standard that world had abandoned. That standard is available to you too. It does not require a workshop or a hangar or a degree in aeronautics. It requires only the willingness to ask, every single time, whether the thing you are doing is real, whether the position you are holding makes sense, whether the system you trust is describing the world as it actually is. And the moment you ask that question honestly, you are no longer a passenger in the system. You are the engineer who decides whether it flies.